The Gift of Cochise, Part 5. Chess Lane had reached a narrow canyon by mid-afternoon and decided to make camp. There was small possibility that he would find another such spot, and he was dead tired, his muscles sogged with fatigue. The canyon was one of those unexpected gashes in the cap rock that gave no indication of its presence until you came right on it. After some searching, Chess found a route to the bottom and made camp under a wind-hollowed overhang. There was water, and there was a small patch of grass. After his horse had a drink and a roll on the ground, it began chomping eagerly at the rich green grass, and Chess built a smokeless fire of ancient driftwood in the canyon bottom. It was his first hot meal in days, and when he had finished, he put out his fire, rolled a smoke, and leaned back contentedly. Before darkness settled, he climbed to the rim and looked over the country. The sun had gone down, and the shadows were growing long. After a half-hour of study, he decided there was no living thing within miles except for the usual desert life. Returning to the bottom, he moved his horse to fresh grass and then rolled in his blanket. For the first time in months, he slept without fear. He woke up suddenly to the broad daylight. The horse was listening to something, his head up. Swiftly, Chess went to the horse and led it back under the overhang, and then he drew on his boots, rolled his blankets, and saddled the horse. Still he heard no sound. Climbing the rim again, he studied the desert and found nothing. Returning to his horse, he mounted up and rode down the canyon towards the flat land beyond. Coming out of the canyon mouth, he rode right into the middle of a war party of more than 20 Apaches, invisible until suddenly they stood up behind rocks, their rifles leveled. He didn't have a chance. Swiftly they bound his wrist to the saddle horn and tied his feet. Only then did he see the man who led the party. It was Cochise. He was a lean, wiry Indian of past 50, his black hair streaked with gray, his features strong and clean-cut. He stared at Lane, and there was nothing in his face to reveal what he might be thinking. Several of the young warriors pushed forward, talking excitedly and waving their arms. Chase Lane understood none of it, but he sat straight in the saddle, his head up, waiting. Then Cochise spoke, and the party turned, and leading his horse, they rode away. The miles grew long, and the sun was hot. He was offered no water. He asked for none. The Indians ignored him. Once a young brave rode near and struck him viciously. Lane made no sound and gave no indication of pain. When they finally stopped, it was beside a huge ant-hill swarming of big red desert ants. Roughly, they untied him and jerked him from the horse. He dug in his heels and shouted at them in Spanish. "The Apaches are women. They tie me to the ants because they are afraid to fight me." An Indian struck him, and Chess glared at the man. If he must die, he would show them how it should be done. Yet he knew the unpredictable nature of the Indian, of his great respect for courage. "Give me a knife, and I will kill any of you warriors." They stared at him. One powerful-built Apache angrily ordered them to get on with it. Cochise spoke. The big warrior replied angrily. Chess Lane nodded at the anthill. "Is this the death of a fighting man? I have fought your strong men and beaten them. I have left no trail for them to follow, and for months I have lived among you, and now only by accident have you captured me. Give me a knife," he said grimly, "and I will fight him." He indicated the big black-faced Apache. The warrior's cruel mouth hardened, and he struck Chess across the face. The white man tasted blood and fury. "Woman," Chess said. Coyote, you are afraid. Chest turned on Cochise as the Indian stood irresolute. Free my hands and let me fight, he demanded. If I win, let me go free. Cochise said nothing to the big Indian. Instantly there was stillness, and then the Apache sprang forward and with a slash of his knife freed Lane's hands. Shaking loose the thongs, Chase Lane chafed his wrist to bring back the circulation. An Indian threw a knife at his feet. It was his own Bowie knife. Chess took off his riding boots and sock feet, his knife gripped low in his hands, its cutting edge up. He looked at the big warrior. I promise you nothing, Cochise said in Spanish, but an honorable death. The big warrior came at him on cat feet. Wirely Chess circled. He had not only to defeat this Apache, but to escape. He permitted himself a side glance toward his horse. It stood alone. No Indian held it. The Apache closed swiftly and thrust wickedly with the knife. Chess, who had learned knife fighting in the bayou country of Louisiana, turned his hip sharply, and the blade slid past him. He struck swiftly, but the Apache's forward movement detected the blade, and it failed to penetrate. However, as it swept up between the Indian's body and arm, it cut a deep gash into the warrior's left armpit. The Indian sprang again, with like a clawing cat, streaming blood. Chess moved aside with a backhand sweep, nicked him, and it felt the sharp bite of the blade. Turning, he paused on the balls of his feet. He had had no water for hours. His lips were cracked, yet he sweated now, and the salt of it stung his eyes. He stared into the malevolent black eyes of the Apache, and then moved to meet him. The Indian lunged, and Chess sidestepped like a boxer and spun on the balls of his foot. The sudden sidestep threw the Indian past him, but Chess failed to drive the knife into the Apache's kidney when his foot rolled on a stone. The point left a thin red line across the Indian's back. The Indian was quick. Before Chess could recover his balance, he grasped the white man's knife wrist. Desperately, Chess grabbed for the Indian's knife hand and got the wrist. They stood there straining, chest to chest, chest to chest. Seeing his chance, Chess suddenly let his knees buckle, then brought up his knee and fell back, throwing the Apache over his head to the sand. Instantly he swirled and was on his feet, standing over the Apache. The warrior had lost his knife, and he lay there, staring up, his black eyes with hatred. Coolly, Chess stepped back, picked up the Indian's knife, and tossed it to him contemptuously. There was a grunt from the watching Indians, and then his antagonist rushed. But loss of blood had weakened the warrior, and Chess stepped in swiftly, struck the blade aside, and then thrust the point of his blade hard against the Indian's belly. Black eyes glared into his own unyielding. A thrust, and the man would be disemboweled, but Chess stepped back. He was a strong man, Chess said in Spanish. It is enough that I have won. Deliberately he walked to his horse and swung into the saddle. He looked around, and every rifle covered him. So he had gained nothing. He had hoped that mercy might lead to mercy, that the Apache respect for fighting man would win his freedom. He had failed. Again, they bound him to his horse, but they did not take his knife from him. When they camped at last, he was given food and drink. He was bound again, and a blanket was thrown over him. At daylight, they were again in the saddle. In Spanish, he asked where they were going, but they gave no indication of hearing. When they stopped again, it was beside a pole corral near a stone cabin.